About that big story this morning. It's all about VAT, and let's talk about what it means with economist and senior manager at PricewaterhouseCoopers, Xhanti Payi. Xhanti, good morning to you. Welcome to the program as always, and thanks for your time. So Treasury says this was as a result of extensive consultations with political parties, careful consideration of parliamentary portfolio committees. The DA, as you've seen, claiming a massive victory this morning, as are some of the other parties, that it was their interdict that shifted the minister's hand. Let's just start with your overall reaction to this announcement today, and then I'll get into the detail from the Treasury and what they said.
Sure. Look, Iman, this is a very confusing time, especially because there are so many moving parts. I think you may have heard yesterday, one of the things that sort of had me shook when I got this announcement was that yesterday we heard from the IMF that they looked at our growth and they've actually reduced it. So we find ourselves at a place now that sort of have all of those moving parts, and then inflation is here. So there's a number of things that are happening at the same time that relate directly to the budget. And so as this shifted, it actually shifts at a space where we're already having to reconsider perhaps our growth outlook. So my sense now is that the work that the minister is announcing around actually finding new ways of raising this money has become much more complex than when we first actually downloaded the first round, delivered the first budget. And so this outcome that has been announced now is going to require much more interrogation by Parliament and by the political parties, because their position has shifted quite significantly since they first had this discussion.
I mean, you talk about, the IMF and revising our growth outlook. I mean, we're already in such a low growth outlook context as it is, and our growth has really been stifled and stunted over the last decade or so. So that's going to have some long-term effects. I think let's just pause there for a second, Xhanti, and unpack that part. I mean, what is going to be the fallout from that?
Here's the thing. So the Minister of Finance, when he delivered the first and the second budget, he put our growth outlook at 1.9%. And that's really where he's actually then benchmarking the revenues he's going to get. Remember, he taxes growth, he taxes output, he taxes what we are actually able to deliver as an economy. So that's where he really actually gets the money. So he assumes that companies are going to grow, they're going to produce more profits. He assumes that individuals are going to earn a little bit more as a result, and that is where he's going to get that revenue. So when we are putting that outlook there, we are saying this is where we expect to grow our kitty. If our kitty now is actually looking less than almost half what he said, that tells us something around what we can then expect in terms of the revenues that we are going to be able to collect over the coming year. And so that's really the main thing here that we are talking about. And then, of course, when we think about then the VAT itself, and we take that out of the equation, that also then obviously takes us a little bit step lower in terms of what we're able to collect. And that's really the kind of crisis we face.
Well, first impacts, right? That budget shortfall of 75 billion rand in the medium term, there's going to be some fallout from that. The statement also says that this decision now not to increase VAT means that the measures to cushion lower income households against the negative impact of the rate increase now need to be withdrawn and other expenditure decisions revisited. And this is interesting because, it also comes in the context of those sort of interactions between him and the SARS commissioner to offset the unavoidable expenditure adjustments. Any additional revenue collected by SARS may be considered for this purpose going forward. But talk to us about the sums of it all and the availability of that money in South Africa's kitty. How does that work practically?
This is exactly the trouble that we find ourselves in. Incidentally, when you think about actually VAT itself, it may very well have been one of the key areas where we would be able to collect. One of the other numbers that we saw yesterday was the inflation increase. Now, here's the dynamic that I think is interesting. I think your viewers will find interesting. We think about VAT as what we can collect when people are able to spend. And so it's an expenditure tax. So when we see inflation coming down, we usually then say, look, when inflation is coming down, people's real incomes tend to go up, because we are also saying, look, your money is being eaten less by inflation. So you have a little bit more in your pocket. Your purchasing power is more. And that gives us a space then to be able to collect that VAT. So with the decreasing inflation, we may have had an opportunity to be able to collect a little bit extra in terms of the VAT. Perhaps we can do that now with the 15%, but it would have given us a nice kicker, given that we had a little bit of that 0.5%. So that may have been a very good place to actually collect revenues, but that is now obviously no longer available in the manner that we had envisaged. So that's the one thing. And then, of course, as I said earlier, the growth outlook is also there. So what is really left in our hands, because we're still, I guess, still stuck at an inability to borrow. So what the minister is indicating is that a lot of hard work has to be now put in cutting expenditure. Now, the dicey part here is how do we actually go about adjusting expenditure? In what areas and in what ways can we actually do that don't harm the poor and don't harm growth going forward? And those are the two important key areas now that we have to think about very, very seriously in a very short period of time.
Because, an image just popped into my mind, Xhanti, when you talk about not harming growth and not harming the poor, they almost seem to be polarized and at the extremities of our economy, because the poor, when we think about our unemployment numbers, you think about people who can't get work, you think about people who are stuck in grants because they simply have no other recourse, and this really low growth environment. They almost seem to be there's no way that we can bring those two things together. So this dynamic of balancing is going to be even harder, I guess, in this context. Yes,
it is critical, and I think even one of the things also we find that is very, very important. One of the things that we also know is that when we give access money, for example, the grants to the poor, that is important actually for consumption and for helping the economy a little bit grow, especially local economies. But we also know that, we have to spend, for example, in infrastructure in municipalities, again, to give ordinary people, small businesses, an opportunity to grow some infrastructure there. We need to spend on education because obviously that has long-term impacts. So all of these things are interrelated, even though they may be polarized, that we can either spend on the poor or on growth. But actually, both of those things are actually interrelated. This is why this balancing act is so difficult and so dangerous at this time, because it is not either or. They have to be pushed together, because that's how we're actually going to turn this thing around. Is that, yes, we want to safeguard the poor today, but also we want to put them in a better place tomorrow. And both those things are very, very important. We've got to do both. But unfortunately, with limited resources, one seems that it actually is something that we have to choose either or. And unfortunately, we've got to do both. Otherwise, we're going to be here again next year and for the many years to come.
All right, so give us a sense, Xhanti, of what happens at Treasury now in terms of finding extra money. You talked about cutting expenditure. The ministry is also going to introduce a revised version of the appropriation bill and the division of revenue bill in the next few weeks. So we're going to see exactly what the nature and scope of it's going to be. But where do you see, and I guess it's hard to say that because it isn't obvious, where do you see places where this magic can happen?
Look, I suspect the kind of things that we've thought about is probably to say, look, where are the places where we look at the year ahead and we say, with everything that's happening in South Africa, with our abilities, our capacity, we talk a lot about capacity, as you know, of the state. What is it that perhaps we could actually cut this year, because we are not likely to be able to achieve, we're not likely to spend. So, for example, I imagine we may say, for example, in some municipalities, we may need to grow some, we need to hire engineers. In some municipalities, we need to do this and that. And so, or we need to train accountants. So we say, look, let's then postpone that expenditure or that allocation, because we're not likely to be able to spend it. Because perhaps we haven't been able to spend in the previous year. So that's one area that might be important to think about and say, look, how is it that we could perhaps postpone some expenditure, and that gives us a little bit of space? So that's one area that might be of consideration. But then at the same time, we also know that there are political implications here, because there are local government elections coming out next year, so that may not be as practical. And then, of course, the hard areas. The minister has talked about restructuring. Now, that's a long-term thing. So there's going to be some very, very hard choices almost immediately. So I think it is, this is the difficulty. But look, the minister, one thing that it was, the previous budget he put in was his best effort. So perhaps we are looking now to the thinking of the political parties, because the minister would have put up his best effort anyway. So let's hear what the political parties have to say outside of what the minister would have thought.
Impact to financial services. I mean, you know, if you're with banks or you have money anywhere, you already start getting the notices about the impact of that VAT increase come the beginning of May. What do you see the impact as being? They've also got to scramble and change their messaging now, I guess. And how else does it affect them?
Sure. Look, I mean, economists usually talk about something called menu costs, and really that means that, you know, every time you change the costs in a restaurant, you have to print a new menu. And we know that VAT is probably one of those things where people would have actually started to think about, you know, changing their systems to be able to calculate the new VAT and to be able to pay it over to SARS as they receive it. So they have to rethink that, because I would have imagined that many people would have started to that when they were messaging us, telling us that, you know, your different service provider telling you about this, that they would have been actually structuring their systems to be able to carry through the extra 0.5%. Now they have to probably change that, and I don't know at what cost that would have been. So that would be interesting to obviously to learn what that would have been like in terms of them actually restructuring their systems to be able to carry this new cost. So that is probably something that's quite likely that we're going to see some impact on. But generally, we know that this VAT, you know, that everybody pays the VAT, collects the VAT on behalf of the receiver, and then pays it over to the receiver. So they're basically, all of them are an agent rather than anything else. So they don't make money from that, they're just an agent. And so it is in that agency position that they have to take in the hit in terms of changing their systems to be able to facilitate the movement of VAT between the different parties and paying it over.
Xhanti Payi, thanks for that.